The United States has a long history of embedding racism into everyday things, bridges, highways, and for decades in this country, even postcards. Because in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Americans were literally turning photographs of lynchings into postcards and mailing them to friends and family as souvenirs. And the people in those photos, they weren't hiding their faces. They were posing, they were smiling, they were having a gay old time. Between the 1880s and the 1960s, more than 4,000 black people were lynched in the United States, and many of those lynchings weren't hidden acts of violence carried out in secret, as a lot of people like to imagine. They were public events where thousands of white spectators would gather to watch. Men, women, and children. It would be a family outing. Newspapers sometimes announced them ahead of time, and special trains even brought in additional crowds to attend. While they didn't exclusively target black people, the vast majority of lynchings and picnics after 1876 focused on black victims, and spectators often fought over body parts afterwards. Bones, teeth, fingers, as souvenirs of the event. People would bring blankets, food, and drinks, and newspapers and participants even described them as lynching picnics. Photographers were often there too, and in some cases they worked with local officials to get a good vantage point of the executions. And afterwards, those photographs would be turned into postcards. They showed the victims hanging from a tree or a structure while white crowds stood around the body, often posing or smiling proudly for the camera like they were taking a hunting trophy photo. Spectators bought these postcards as souvenirs and mailed them to friends and family around the country. It was a lucrative business. The messages written on the back could be just as disturbing as the images themselves. One postcard famously read, quote, "This is the barbecue we had last night." The U.S. Postmaster General banned lynching postcards from being sent through the mail in 1908 because of the brutality, but that didn't stop the practice. People simply would stick them inside envelopes, and the images continued circulating for decades well into the 20th century. These weren't fringe events carried out by secret extremist groups. They were community spectacles. Ordinary people attended them. Ordinary people posed for the photos. Ordinary people bought the postcards, and they would send them to their relatives. Which brings me to something interesting about how people think about racism. If you've seen or read the book, The Help, there's a scene where Tilly Holbrook tells Skeeter not to carry around a booklet called The Compilation of Jim Crow Laws of the South. She tells her that she could get into serious trouble because there are quote-unquote some real racists in town. But the irony is that Hilly herself is actually extremely racist and is actively enforcing segregation. She's campaigning for the Home Health Sanitation Initiative to force black domestic workers to use separate bathrooms in the houses they're working at. She doesn't see herself as racist. She just thinks the real racists are the violent ones who are extremists and wear hoods and burn crosses. But during Jim Crow, segregation itself was violence. Everyday people upheld it and didn't think they were doing anything wrong. The same was true at these lynchings. Many of the spectators probably didn't think of themselves as monsters because they weren't the ones tying the rope. They weren't the ones doing the killing. They were just watching. They were just taking pictures. They were just buying the souvenirs and the postcards. But racial terror in the U.S. wasn't maintained only by a handful of extremists. It was maintained by ordinary people who participated and normalized it and made excuses for it and decided to look the other way. And that's why conversations about racism today aren't just about obvious hate groups and outright violent racism, because racism has continued to evolve in a myriad of ways. These conversations are about systems, culture, silence, and the everyday ways people either challenge injustice or help normalize it. You don't have to think that you're a real racist to still participate in racism. And that's exactly why being actively anti-racist matters, especially now more than ever. Until next time, y'all.